Hello and welcome to today's session. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Hello and welcome. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to just give some updated announcements. Next Wednesday on November 18th, we've partnered with the North Carolina Occupational Safety and Health Education and Research Center to offer a free webinar on emerging technologies, the future of ergonomics. On Wednesday, December 2nd, Dr. Ellen Eisen will be presenting her research on job loss, suicide, and overdose, a case study on Michigan auto workers. Our next industrial hygiene webinar will be on Tuesday, December 8th with Dr. Ramachandran on data, professional judgment, and modeling and occupational exposure assessment. And this is in partnership with Johns Hopkins Education and Research Center for Occupational Safety and Health. For more information, you can visit us at coeh@berkeley.edu/aboutce. And on behalf of the Education and Research Centers throughout the country, we're pleased to present the Industrial Hygiene Webinar Series, offering free webinars the second Tuesday of each month. This collaborative effort is on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program and aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIEHS ERC programs. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today's webinar, Biomonitoring and Risk Assessment, Essential Concepts and Emerging Technology, is brought to you by the University of Cincinnati Education and Research Center and Dr. John Reichard. A few housekeeping items first. You'll be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A. We'll save time at the end of the presentation to address questions. All participants who log in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive a link to the recording and an evaluation form tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific. This evaluation will qualify participants for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once the evaluation is completed, you'll be able to print and access your certificate. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the COEH Northern California's YouTube page and on our website. At this time, we are pleased to welcome our presenter. Dr. John Reichard is Assistant Professor of Toxicology and Risk Assessment in the Department of Environmental and Public Health Sciences at the University of Cincinnati and Director of the Biological Monitoring Component of the DEPHS Education and Research Center. He has a doctoral degree in pharmacy and toxicology with postdoctoral training at the University of Cincinnati in epigenetics and Boston Children's Hospital in transchromic response to hypoxia. He is also Senior Pharmaceutical Strategist with NASA Human Health and Performance Directorate, a pharmacological industry consultant providing human health risk assessment and a Pharmacokinetics services, and currently serves as a collaborating scientist with the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it. Make sure I'm not muted here. Oh, I'm good. So I guess everyone can see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you very much, Michelle. I appreciate that kind introduction. Before I get started, I would like to just take 1 second to thank the University of Cincinnati ERC, or Education Research Center, and Tina Raponen, who's the PI of the UCERC. And also thank NIEHS for their support of the UCERC, as well as the biomonitoring component of the program. So as you said, my presentation today is entitled The Biomonitoring and Risk Assessment, Essential Concepts in Emerging Technology. Learning objectives that I hope to achieve by the end of this talk would be to provide a general understanding of biomarkers and their use in aggregate exposure analysis and risk assessment, to introduce and describe the concept of adverse outcome pathways and their use in biomonitoring, to introduce some advanced methods and new areas of biomonitoring research, and hopefully to contextualize biomonitoring concepts through the use of real-world examples. So the CDC defines biomonitoring as a method for assessing human exposure and chemicals or their effects by measuring these chemicals, their metabolites, or reaction products in human specimens. And while this is a pretty good definition of biomonitoring from kind of the classical standpoint, it really does focus on the measurement of chemicals in the body and doesn't really extend to other more contemporary uses of health-based biomonitoring. The definition that I kind of prefer is this one proposed or articulated by SCOT, which is a scientific committee for occupational toxicology. And they define biomonitoring as the repeated control measurement of chemical or biochemical markers in fluids, tissues, or other accessible samples from a subject's exposed or exposed in the past or to be exposed to chemical, physical, or biological risk factors in the workplace and or the general environment. And aside from being quite a mouthful, what I do kind of like about this definition is that it's expanded to include exposures that are not just chemical exposures themselves, but also the physical stresses and biological responses to chemical exposures. It includes repeated control measurement, which relates to having a formalized biomonitoring program, which includes protocols and biomarker validation. And it also includes future exposures that supports assessment of susceptible populations through risk assessment. So when should we use biomonitoring? Biomonitoring is really applicable only when we have stressors, physical or chemical stressors, that have some sort of systemic effect. And what this means essentially is that you have an external exposure of, let's say for instance, to a chemical, and that chemical then can enter the body through crossing a biological membrane like the gastrointestinal tract and reaches the systemic circulation, it reaches the blood, right? And then from that site of absorption into the body, it then distributes throughout the body where it then affects a target tissue. All right, so it's a systemic effect and not, which would contrast with a local effect. So biomonitoring really is focused on these type of exposures that are resulting in some sort of systemic effect. If a chemical's toxicologic mode of action is understood, biomonitoring can be used to evaluate a number of different things. It can be used to evaluate the fate of the chemical or its metabolites within the body, and we refer to that as toxicokinetics. It can be used to evaluate the mechanisms of disease, which relates to toxicodynamics, which is the effect that a chemical has on the body. And it can be used to investigate individual factors that influence susceptibility, either in incidence or severity of adverse effect. So biomonitoring is typically used to demonstrate an association between the amount of a chemical that gets into the body. We refer to that either as internal dose or body burden. And the relationship between that internal dose and the exposure that one has, and the relationship between that internal dose and health effects. But beyond being just kind of an approach to evaluate dose response, biomonitoring can also be used to address other concerns. It can be used as a gold standard to evaluate misclassification of worker exposures. So you might have an incidence where you have workers where you think you have the exposure well under control through engineering means or something like that. You could do biomonitoring and find out that the workers actually have a far greater exposure than what you think, and I'll show an example of that here shortly. Risk assessment can be used, or biomonitoring can be used with risk assessment to benchmark exposures to safe exposure limits. It can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of control measures, as I just kind of mentioned. And biomarkers can also reflect health-related covariates like environmental temperature, which can be important with regards to dermal exposure to chemicals, because increased blood flow into the skin could perhaps increase the absorption of chemical through the skin. heavy workload can certainly increase respiratory rate, and respiratory rate could predispose somebody to breathing a greater dose of airborne chemical or dust. I think I saw a hand go up. Not sure if I should respond to that or not, because I can't see it. And then, should I keep going?
Yes, go ahead. We'll take care of any questions in the chat ourselves.
All right. So, and then individual factors can also be evaluated. So you could have a sexual dimorphic expression of enzyme or transporter, which means that it's expressed more in, say, females than in males, or vice versa. Race can be an issue in terms of some, there are people who express high affinity receptors versus other races that might have a low affinity receptor or level of expression. And then even cultural differences can actually make a big difference, where you have individuals who, for instance, just behaviorally use social networks and family and friends as a source of information, as opposed to official sources of information, which can predispose to differences in health outcomes. So from an occupational standpoint, there's essentially three main routes of exposure that we worry about for chemicals entering the body. Lungs with inhalation, skin with dermal exposure, and then less so with oral ingestion and gastrointestinal exposures, although these can be important. And I'm thinking, of a case that I was working on not too long ago involving agricultural workers and exposure to pesticide, where some of the highest levels were in the agricultural workers that smoked, and the reason the reason why that is because they're taking the cigarettes out of the pack and putting them to their mouth, potentially still with pesticide contaminated gloves on, and giving themselves a solid oral ingestion exposure. Regardless of the route of exposure, biomonitoring aggregates exposures from all routes. So it's basically giving you the sum of what the exposure is from inhalation and dermal and gastrointestinal. And while that's an advantage of biomonitoring, one of the downsides is that you can't, from what's in the body, you can't tell where that came from. So you can't necessarily, from the biomonitoring data alone, back calculate what the exposure route was. But regardless, ultimately, what biomonitoring is doing is making that association between a systemic body burden, that internal dose, and the adverse effect that results from it. So this figure illustrates one example of an aggregate chemical exposure. This figure shows the correlation between pyrene on the skin and in the air versus a metabolite of pyrene, 1-hydroxypyrene, which is a biomarker of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which is in the urine of these coke oven workers. So in this figure, the x-axis is the pH biomarker in urine concentration. So concentration in the urine is on the x-axis, and the y-axis represents either pH exposure in the air, which are the pink dots, or on the skin, which is the red dots, or in the air plus on the skin, which are the black dots. So this basically what this figure shows is that in these workers, an evaluation of pH based on air sampling alone would significantly have underestimated the worker's total exposure. These biomarker data show that in the workers, with both dermal and inhalation exposures, the internal dose is much greater than would be just expected based on inhalation or dermal alone. And so these data can really be used to demonstrate that, or to show that biomarker or a biomonitoring type of approach can be used as a reality check on other assessment approaches like air sampling. So in biomonitoring, there are three types of biomarkers that we can use, so we can look at. There's biomarkers of exposure, and these are what traditionally and classically are used. And these are, this could be a chemical, it could be a metabolite of the chemical, or it could be a product that results from the interaction of the chemical with a biomolecule within the body, like a protein or DNA forming an adduct. And these represent that internal exposure of the exposed individual. Effect biomarkers can provide information about an individual's health status, or a response to an intervention from a chemical exposure, resulting from a chemical exposure. That should give some insight into changes before the adverse effects are clinically apparent. And then a biomarker of susceptibility is an indicator that if exposed, an individual will have a greater probability of an adverse effect to a specific chemical or class of chemicals than what would be expected from the general population. These biomarkers of susceptibility are often investigated and often represent what we often refer to as a gene-environment interaction. These are commonly gene polymorphisms, a polymorphism being a mutation in DNA that results in a difference in the structure or function of a protein, in some case altering either the protein's structure in such a way that it has a lower affinity for the substrate that it metabolizes, or changes the protein's expression. And these changes then can result in a change in propensity of a worker towards an adverse health effect resulting from a chemical exposure. So ideally, a biomarker should be evaluated from a matrix that is as least invasive as possible. And generally speaking, the most biologically acceptable, the most, well, from the worker standpoint anyhow, the most acceptable ways to evaluate biomarkers would be like in the breath or in the saliva or in the sweat. The urine works as well. More invasive methods would include things like blood sampling. This requires needles. Workers, unless it's really needed to do it this way, blood sampling is not necessarily the ideal for a regular biomonitoring program. And then, of course, in the research realm, you could have tissue sampling, which would require biopsies. So, but anything that involves large needles, biopsies or probes tend not to be very well suited for a routine biomonitoring program. The appropriate matrix to sample really depends on the biomarker that's being measured. Urine is really easy because it requires really no training, just a couple of words of instruction, doesn't require a nurse or anything like that. And urine is great because it can reflect cumulative absorption, and you can calculate what the total absorbed dose is from a urine sample if it's if the biomonitoring study is properly conducted. Blood samples are great because they really are most relevant to what the tissue concentrations are, but they also represent more of a snapshot at any one particular time of what the internal concentration is, and you have to be very careful with blood sampling procedures. Ultimately, an effective biomarker must be capable of separating, though, exposed individuals from unexposed individuals and populations with high risk from those with low risk. This figure just kind of is, I know it's kind of bland, but it represents kind of a hypothetical distribution of workers with a urine concentration of some biomarker represented on the X scale. On the Y scale represents the fraction of workers with urine concentrations within a particular range. As is kind of typical for distribution for a biomonitoring study, the distribution is skewed to the right, with most workers down at the lower level concentration and a few unfortunate workers kind of at the higher concentrations. We wouldn't normally use parametric testing like t-tests and stuff like that to evaluate these workers compared to unexposed populations, unless we did something like transform the data. So you just take the log of the urine concentration, and now you have a normal distribution, and we can compare this distribution to say a control population. And let's say that in this figure we have two populations. We have the red population, which is an unexposed group of people, and we have the black, which are exposed And the area under the curve represents the biomarker level in these individuals. And as you can see, the two populations are very similar with a lot of overlap. And we could do a t-test or some other statistical test to determine whether or not these two distributions are the same. But the one thing that we know is that there's a lot of uncertainty between these two groups. And really, no matter how good your assay is, this biomarker is not going to be a very effective way to separate these two populations. As a result, this would really mean that you're going to have a great deal of uncertainty in classifying these two groups, and you're probably going to have, or you would have, a lot of misclassification. In contrast, we could look at this, at these two groups. Let's say this is a different biomarker. And this biomarker looks like it would be pretty good at separating these two populations. There's much less overlap between the unexposed and the exposed populations, and therefore a lot less uncertainty. In individuals with this biomarker level in the region of uncertainty, there will still be some misclassification of those individuals, but by and large, it's a much cleaner separation. And then suppose, let's say we have a biomarker assay that could be used to separate then these two populations. And that's represented here by the kind of the green vertical line. Below the threshold for this biomarker assay, the test gives a negative result. And above that threshold, it gives a positive result. In the area of the uncertainty, some people who are negative will still test positive. That's highlighted in orange, and these are false positives. And some people who are positive may still test negative, and this is highlighted in blue, and these are false negatives. And it should be noted that really most bioassays are not entirely perfect. There's always going to be some degree of, there's always going to be some rate of false positive and false negatives reported by any assay. Which brings us then to biomarker validation. And validation is really a huge issue in biomonitoring because for a biomarker to be useful in biomonitoring, it must have some predictive value for identifying either the exposure, the clinical outcome, or the susceptibility of the population to an adverse effect. The two essential key metrics for validation are sensitivity and specificity, with sensitivity being the proportion of true values that are correctly identified by an assay as being positive, and specificity being the proportion of true negatives that are correctly identified by the assay as being negatives. So the sensitivity avoids high sensitivity avoids false negative results, and high specificity avoids false positive results. The importance of specificity and sensitivity really depends a lot on context. For diagnostic purposes, you would probably want a test that has high sensitivity so that you don't tell someone that they are fine when they're really not, because you had false negative results. And this would go to the same extent it would apply to workers as well. And from the standpoint of public health, screening assays often err on the side of lower sensitivity, thus resulting in a higher rate of false positives, and high specificity, resulting high specificity, so you have low false negative rates. And this is because really it's better from the standpoint of public health, and you could think of the coronavirus testing, like the rapid tests and stuff, kind of in this regard, that it's better for someone to think that they are positive for an exposure and then have that either confirmed or disproven later on, than it is for them to not know or to think that they're not contagious or they don't have a disease when they really do. So if that makes sense. That actually happened to the governor of Ohio here maybe a month and a half ago or something like that, where he took the rapid test for coronavirus and it came back positive. And then subsequent testing with the more gold standard test demonstrated that he was in fact negative. But that's kind of health protective from the standpoint of public health, because you want an assay that's going to detect when someone really, really is positive, but maybe occasionally you make a mistake when they're negative. And so context is really important. There are also some individuals who refer to what's thought of as a biomonitoring disconnect. And there's a couple different examples of this disconnect. I've got two listed here. The first one is where you have a situation where the chemical exposure level, such as in the air, don't correlate with the concentration of the compound or its metabolite in the body. Or it doesn't correlate with response. And that can happen for a number of pharmacokinetic reasons, including things like, how quickly it takes for a chemical to come to steady state, these kind of, how, for example, if you're doing spot sampling compared to longitudinally sampling workers to evaluate the amount of chemical within the body over time. The other example that I have is a relationship between exposure into internal body dose, which may not in some cases be linear. And this often occurs when there is saturation of enzyme pathways or transporter pathways, in which case maybe you get plateau of the amount of chemical within the body. Another example would be when there's a change in the expression of the enzymes that are responsible for metabolism. And again, this can happen when enzymes are induced or inhibited. This is an example of just kind of one of these nonlinear events. Here we have two populations of workers. We have workers in production, which are represented by a black triangle, and workers in maintenance represented by an open circle. The x-axis is the concentration on dimethyl fumarate in the worker's personal airspace. That's in parts per million. And the y-axis represents the concentration of a metabolite, which is monomethyl fumarate, in the urine, in the collected urine. And you can see that up to about 6 parts per million, or 6 ppm, there's a fair correlation between MMF and DMF. And then above 6 ppm, urine MMF plateaus, even though you have a continuing increase in the amount of DMF exposure. And there's several possible explanations for why this might happen. One might be that there's saturation of the metabolizing enzyme that mediates the conversion of DMF to MMF, but this is actually unlikely because this occurs in the blood, and the blood has a great deal of capacity for carrying out this metabolic process. It could also be that there is a situation where you have saturation of the absorption pathway, but this is also unlikely because DMF is pretty lipophilic, and in this case, MMF seems to decline. And what you'd really expect to see if there was saturation of the absorption pathway is that you would have an active transporter that would efficiently transport the chemical at lower concentrations, would then become saturated, and then you'd have less efficient transport at higher concentrations. So you'd have a biphasic kind of curve, but always increasing. And here, what it actually seems to do is go down. And so what is actually likely happening here is that you have enzyme induction. And this actually makes sense knowing something about the structure of DMF. It's alpha beta unsaturated aldehyde. It's an electrophile, and these kind of compounds are very capable of inducing the antioxidant response gene battery. And this, when this response is induced, it'll the cells, especially at the liver, will upregulate the expression of metabolizing enzymes that are capable of conjugating and metabolizing these kind of compounds. And so what's probably happening is that DMF is inducing its own metabolism. It's being conjugated with glutathione and eliminated in the urine. And if we were looking for the conjugated DMF and possibly conjugated MMF in the urine instead of just MMF alone, we might see an increase in that conjugate product in the urine sample. So what you look for can be important as well. So up to this point, I've kind of alluded to pharmacokinetics a number of times without really discussing it in particular and in more detail. Pharmacokinetics can be, I guess, in a kind of simplistically thought of as what the body does to a chemical. Pharmacokinetic models are commonly used as tools to translate external exposures into internal body concentrations. They're commonly used to integrate biomonitoring data in conventional risk assessment paradigms. Well, let me just stop right there for 1 second, though, and also say that, and make a comment about the use of the term toxicokinetics and pharmacokinetics. This is a kind of a discussion that I have often with people about what the difference is between these two terms. They're often used interchangeably. I use them interchangeably regularly enough. To me, they're pretty much synonymous. Toxicokinetics and pharmacokinetics, in essence, are pretty much the same thing. You're using the same equations, the same principles apply. The real difference is the difference in connotation, where pharmacokinetics is really used more to refer to concentrations and the behavior of a chemical within humans, whereas toxicokinetics is more about the behavior of a chemical within animals. And the real distinction there isn't so much the species difference, it's the use difference. And in toxicology studies, we tend to use doses of chemicals that are 1,000 times higher or 100 times higher than what you would ever achieve with normal human exposure. And at those really high concentrations, you can get some pretty crazy behavior of chemicals. You get saturation of enzymes that likely under far lower concentrations would never become saturated. You can get other behaviors related to toxicity in the animal. And in pharmacokinetics, these are more akin to concentrations, exposures, levels of chemical in the body of humans that are much more achievable under normal exposure conditions. So classical pharmacokinetics usually describes the distribution of a chemical within 1, 2, or sometimes 3 hypothetical compartments within the body. It's rarely ever more than 3 compartments. And this figure on the right here kind of illustrates one of these kind of models where you have an external compartment, which is the GI tract, and then you have absorption from the GI tract. And I should add that the GI tract is still considered outside the body because it's contiguous with the outside environment. And then you have absorption of the chemical from the lumen of the GI tract into the central compartment, which is typically the blood compartment of the body. And then you have distribution between that central compartment and peripheral compartments, and describing that distribution, you have these simple rate constants that are concentration dependent and reflect the equilibrium flow of chemical in and out of the central and peripheral compartment. And you also have a rate constant that describes the elimination of the chemical from the body, which is the rate of elimination, of course. And that describes then the removal of the chemical from that central compartment. And that rate of elimination is important because we can use that to directly derive what we refer to as the systemic half-life of the chemical. And I'll come back to half-life in just a second. So pharmacokinetics is typically divided into 4 components: absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination. And I want to distinguish a little bit between absorption and bioavailability as well. But absorption is the fraction of a chemical that is absorbed into the body, is taken up into the body. Bioavailability is the proportion of a substance that is not only taken up into the body, but also reaches systemic circulation and distributes throughout the body. One explanation or the distinction between absorption and bioavailability is important because you can have situations where a chemical is well absorbed, but poorly bioavailable. And that can happen especially with oral ingestion of a chemical, where the chemical is absorbed from the GI system. And anything that's absorbed from the intestines, from the stomach, from the intestines, goes into what's referred to as the portal circulation. And the portal circulation is the blood flow basically through the abdomen, through the intestines, through the stomach, around the peritoneum. And all that blood flow collects and goes directly to the liver after it perfuses everything else in the abdomen. So if something's absorbed from the GI system, the first place it goes is to the liver. And if it goes to the liver, and the liver has the ability to extract that drug from the blood, so extract all the drug from the blood, or all the chemical from the blood, then that chemical never makes it into the systemic circulation. And what you find then in the blood, if you were to do sampling, primarily would be the metabolites of that compound. So for absorption, we can measure the amount of chemical that's absorbed into the body by by summing the amount of both the parent and all the related metabolites that are retrieved from the urine, potentially the feces, and also breath, if that's also one route of elimination. Sometimes that's the case for volatile compounds. With bioavailability, the approach is a little bit different. Bioavailability is often measured by comparing blood concentrations in, say, for instance, an individual who's exposed to a chemical by measuring. So you measure the amount of that chemical in the blood, and you compare that to what concentration you would expect if that same dose had been injected by like an intravenous injection of some sort. And this then you can get a fraction of how much of a chemical was absorbed into the body. So that kind of covers absorption. And I want to talk also, because metabolism is extremely important in biomonitoring for several reasons, but primarily because you can get saturation of the enzymes that mediate the elimination of the chemical. So metabolism is simply this process by which an enzyme catalyzes the change of a molecule from one chemical form to another. And there's two parameters that are typically used to describe the efficiency, the activity of an enzyme and its ability to metabolize the substance. And these two parameters are Vmax and Km. Vmax could just be thought of as the metabolic capacity of the enzyme. If you have more enzyme, you have more metabolic capacity. All right. And so the figure on the right basically shows, well, what would happen if you were to increase the expression level of an enzyme 5-fold. And if you do that, what happens is the velocity of the enzyme goes up substantially. All right. And the result of that is that the enzyme has the ability to do a lot more work. And this is what happens when an enzyme becomes induced. It's just much more capable. It functions much more quickly. There's more enzyme to do the work. Km is really just the concentration of a substance that interacts with the enzyme. Km is that affinity of the enzyme for the substance, is that the affinity, that interaction. If there's a gene mutation or polymorphism that changes the enzyme structure and increases the affinity, say for example, of the enzyme for a substance, then that enzyme will become saturated at a much lower concentration. And that's represented here by that transition from kind of the blue trace to the red line, the red tracing on this figure. Conversely, if the change in structure decreases the affinity of the enzyme for the substrate, or if there's competition with another substance, then you have a decrease in the affinity, and the result is shown by the green line. So you get this transition from the normal enzyme, which is represented by the blue line, to an enzyme that has much lower affinity, which is the green line. And this is all represented by the Km in terms of concentration. So a high Km represents low concentration. It's kind of counterintuitive, but And the point, one of the points that I'd like to make here is that with the low affinity enzyme, what you can see is that even at the highest concentrations, that green line has not yet reached saturation. It's not yet reached its full enzyme velocity. It still has room to go. Whereas the red trace shows that even at this very, very low concentration, the enzyme is fully saturated and functioning at full velocity. And this is important when it comes to a number of different compounds, especially a compound like benzoate pyrene, which is one type of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. Benzoate pyrene undergoes a series of enzymatic steps during its metabolism, the last one of which generates a very DNA reactive epoxide. Metabolism of the epoxide is mediated by an enzyme called glutathione S transferase. And this enzyme protects against the reaction of the epoxide with DNA. And when the epoxide does react with DNA, it produces these BAP DNA adducts. All right, so it forms an adduct with DNA, and if there aren't too many of them, the cell can fix those pretty efficiently. But if there's a lot of them, then the protective system becomes overwhelmed, and what happens is you wind up with mutations, and mutations predispose to cancer. And so individuals who have a polymorphism of glutathione S transferase and have a reduced function or reduced or loss of the enzyme are at a significantly increased risk of developing cancer as a result. And then the last concept in pharmacokinetics that I wanted to hit on was elimination. Not to oversimplify, but elimination is really one of the most important parameters when it comes to evaluating repeat exposures. Elimination describes this rate at which a chemical is removed from the body. The rate can be expressed in terms of half-life, which is the time required then for the chemical to within the body to be reduced by 1/2. And it's a critical factor for determining the internal body concentration with these repeat exposures. And so, for example, the figure on the right shows an individual worker who's exposed to a 12 milligram internal dose. Well, actually 2 workers. So one worker is a fast metabolizer with a half-life of 1 day for this compound. And the other worker has a half-life of 5 days for this compound. And the figure shows that for the fast metabolizer, week over week, there's no accumulation of the chemical within the body. There is some day over day accumulation. So between Monday and Friday, there's some accumulation. And then over the weekend, it drops back down to a very low level. And then on Monday, there's exposure and some accumulation Monday through Friday, and then it drops back down again. But you can see the slow metabolizer, week over week, there is an accumulation of body burden. There's an accumulation of the internal dose of this chemical, and it's never fully removed from the body. Even with those weekends, you only get partial removal. And then following that, with the next week of exposure, you get to an even higher level and a higher level. And so this is largely dependent on half-life of the chemical and how it behaves then within the body with repeat exposures. There are a number of limitations with pharmacokinetics, with classical pharmacokinetics. The models are empirical. You can only make predictions about the drugs or chemicals that you have looked at. You can't extend a classical pharmacokinetic model to other chemicals. You can't extrapolate very easily animal data to humans data without a large degree of uncertainty. The models are typically discrete. That is, they're based on centric measurements of human population, like a glomerular filtration rate, which is an enzyme rate, which is not an enzyme rate, which is the rate at which materials are filtered from the blood by the kidney. And it reflects kidney function. So these very discrete values produce a discrete model, not a probabilistic model. So you can't say, whether your model is going to capture 95% of the population or 5% of the population. You can't know. And the models are static. They can't account for changes in enzyme expression or changes in life stage of an individual, perhaps as they go from childhood to adolescence. One way to get around this is with physiologically based pharmacokinetic model. And these are much more complex, mathematically complex models that describe the body in terms of a series of compartments. You have about as many compartments as you need to accurately predict what the concentration of the chemical is going to be in the body. The great thing about these models is that they can be extrapolated from animal to humans just by reparameterizing the models. You can use them to extrapolate between routes of exposure. The models can account for multiple uncertainties at one time, which you can't do with a classical model, which is empirical. And so you study one parameter, one variable at a time with an empirical model. The models can be extended to other similar chemicals. The models are dynamic and can account for changes in population, and they can account for changes in gene expression, changes in enzyme expression, changes in growth or maturation of a child. And the models are probabilistic. Which brings me then to chemical risk assessment. So far what we've talked about are measures and metrics related to the relationship between internal and external exposure, so pharmacokinetics, and some discussion about the relationship between dose and effect, so dose response modeling. But risk assessment has really four major components. The big one that I want to talk about here is hazard identification. And hazard identification really is just a matter of saying, is a compound toxic? If it is toxic, why is it toxic? How is it toxic? And if the models are based on animal studies, are those toxicities relevant to humans? Once you know something about hazard, then you can begin to look at the relationship between those hazards and dose, and the relationship between the hazard, between the toxicological hazard and the external exposure and how that gets into the body and so forth. And then the last component of the traditional risk assessment paradigm is risk characterization, which just takes all this information, evaluates uncertainty and variability in the data, and applies uncertainty factors to account for that. The cornerstone of risk assessment, though, is animal testing. And the problem with animal testing is really slow, it's expensive, it doesn't provide a lot of biological insight, at least not from the standpoint of toxicity testing, where you're basically counting legs in the air, number of lesions in a liver or something like that. Not very biologically informative. What this figure is depicting is a more contemporary approach referred to as an adverse outcome pathway. Adverse outcome pathways are great because it's kind of a structured, formalized way of including biomarkers into risk assessment. And it provides a practical approach for evaluating weight of evidence, especially when we're dealing with evidence from non-animal toxicity testing type of studies, bioassays. So a typical adverse outcome pathway is anchored at the start and at the end. The start of an adverse outcome pathway is generally considered what's called a molecular initiating event, or MIE. An MIE is a perturbation that initiates a response within the pathway. And then at the end of the pathway is this phenotypic outcome or adverse effect. And so these are the 2 points that anchor the adverse outcome pathway. And then in between, you have multiple steps, key events that represent intermediate steps in the pathway, leading ultimately to this adverse outcome. The great thing about adverse outcome pathways is that they're not chemical specific. Any chemical that has the same molecular initiating event and has the same adverse effect, same adverse effect as an outcome, is going to have the same AOP. It's going to have the same sequence of events. So the nice thing about the AOP then is that it easily incorporates biomarker data and pharmacokinetic modeling information. And so the gray boxes here that are just to the right of this, the molecular initiating event really represent the exposure component, all right? This is the chemical, the first gray box represents the external chemical exposure, which you would normally detect using some sort of exposure measurement device. And then the second gray box represents that biomarker of exposure, and between the chemical exposure and the internal dose is where you have your pharmacokinetics. Once the chemical is inside the body, now it can interact with target tissues or with target proteins within the body. And that's where it initiates then that molecular initiating event. That's where it triggers that event. And that trigger then sets off this cascade of biological events that go basically up in terms of biological complexity, from cells to tissues, from tissues to organs. And these are the things that we measure with the biomarkers of effect. And then susceptibility biomarkers are really modulators of either the dose response or the hazard associated with the chemical. Why do I tell you this? And why is this important? Well, EPA under TSCA has classified over 86,000 chemicals that are currently in commerce in the United States. And the REACH inventory in Europe has classified or categorized or indexed, whatever you want to term, over 100,000 chemicals that are in commerce in Europe. And you compare those numbers to the number of chemicals where we have authoritative risk assessments for chemicals, where we know what the safe exposure level is for those chemicals. And as of November this year, the EPA has 571 chemical exposure limits, RFDs or RFCs, for chemicals that are in commerce in the United States. This compares to, this slide is actually a recycled slide from 2016, and you can see I crossed out the 2016 number, which was 568 RFDs. And what that tells you is that over the last 4 years, there's been 3 new chemical assessments for RFCs. So basically, there's an urgent need for biomonitoring type of studies to address the number of chemicals that are out there, because animal studies aren't cutting it. So one solution that has been proposed and has been trialed has been to use in vitro testing and bioassays to replace animal studies, which are slow and expensive. The in vitro testing is really primarily focused on identifying hazards for chemicals and documenting human exposures. And there's right now 2 chemical programs. I'm not going to go into the details. It's just to say that TOX21 is one program that has very large chemical space. That is, they're testing a lot of chemicals, but very narrow biologic space. So they're not testing those chemicals in very many types of bioassays. And ToxCast is kind of the flip side. It's only testing about 1,800 chemicals, or has tested only 1,800 chemicals, but has a much larger biological space with a number of, over 700 high-throughput bioassays that map to almost 1/2 of all the KEGG pathways. KEGG is a database of biological pathways, and they map to over 1/2 of all the KEGG pathways that have been documented. And I believe this is my last slide, because what I want to tell you about is kind of this situation that occurred in 2014. This is what's referred to as the Elk River spill, where a large 10,000 gallons of this compound called MCHC was spilled into the Elk River in West Virginia. And the thing about that is that the spill was just upriver from the municipal water intake for Charleston. And the plume of chemical that was that spilled into the river then flowed downstream past Charleston, where it was taken into their water into the water system, flowed downstream to the Ohio River, and then from there downstream through Cincinnati, through Louisville, down to the Mississippi. And all of these cities along the Ohio River all use the Ohio River as their water source. And when this spill occurred, there was very little information, almost no information about this chemical. This is one of those 80,000 chemicals where we had, where it's in commerce, it's used all the time in mining and coal industry, but we had almost no information toxicologically about it. And in order to address the rapid and urgent need for information about this chemical, one of the things they did was they ran it through the ToxCast assay system to identify whether or not it interacted with any of these well-documented toxicological tox pathways to identify how this chemical might interact with organ systems within the body if it were to be consumed in somebody's drinking water. And we were kind of fortunate in that we were able to demonstrate that this particular chemical wasn't exceedingly toxic. It didn't interact with a lot of with any of the major pathways that were tested and reviewed in that study. So to kind of summarize then, strengths of biomonitoring include that it can sum internal exposures for all different routes, but it cannot be used to distinguish which route of exposure a chemical gets into the body. It reflects individual differences in exposure, pharmacokinetics, and pharmacodynamics. It can expand on, it can inform information about polymorphisms in susceptible populations. And it can be used in species extrapolation. Biomonitoring is great because it gets closer to that relationship between health outcomes than environmental sampling does, because it's giving you information about the internal body concentration or the biological response to an exposure that the other sampling methods don't do. It gives detailed insight into the effectiveness of the exposure control measures, so you can truly evaluate whether somebody has been exposed or not to in a workplace setting, for example, and whether or not engineering controls or other measures have been effective. And it provides information on mechanisms that link exposures to outcomes. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. At this time, if you have a question, you are welcome to enter it into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we have an opportunity to. One of the first questions that came in, someone was commenting on your definitions of sensitivity and specificity, and said, as an IH, I always viewed sensitivity as a limit of detection or quantification, and specificity as the ability of the analytical method to measure a specific target agent without interference. Do you have any further thoughts on the definitions of sensitivity versus specificity?
I think that you know, there's different ways to look at them, and what the questioner has just said, I think, is entirely consistent, but just kind of a different way of thinking about them. I think from I guess I'm kind of thinking of it more from a statistical standpoint, and they're thinking about it more from an application standpoint. But otherwise, I think that it's entirely consistent with it's entirely consistent with the same the interpretation is entirely consistent with the same definition.
Thank you. Can the pharmacokinetic models, for example, PBPK, predict the likelihood of an adverse health effect?
Only if you can link the pharmacokinetic model to a pharmacodynamic model. And so we call that PBPK PD modeling. Pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic models. It's definitely a kind of a it's a computational stretch, I think, in many cases. You have to have really good pharmacodynamic data, and that's usually the harder part of the whole thing to get. And can be difficult to get from animal studies. So usually you have to rely on some metric in human studies. It's definitely something that's easier to do in the pharma industry than it is in environmental or occupational health, because in the pharma industry, you actually have human data that you can build your model on.
Thank you. How many known polymorphs are there, and how well characterized are they?
Polymorphisms, there are millions. There are a lot, and there's a lot of caveats to them. Not a lot of caveats, but there are definitely caveats to them. You know, a polymorphism can result in a change in a protein by changing an amino acid within the protein structure, which changes the protein's function. You can also have polymorphisms that will change the DNA sequence, but have no effect on the protein itself because it doesn't result in a change in the amino acid sequence. And those are silent polymorphisms. And then you can also have polymorphisms that fall into parts of the DNA that don't code for an express part of a protein, don't code for RNA that is expressed as a protein. And those can also be silent. And then I'm sure that there's also polymorphisms that locate into areas that regulate the that regulate the expression level of proteins and don't actually result in a change in the protein itself, but result in a change in how that protein is expressed. So there's a lot of different polymorphisms, but there are, I mean, just the sheer number of polymorphisms is absolutely astronomical. And so I guess in general, you would say that they're not very well characterized, except for in a few cases where we've linked those polymorphisms to some really significant health effect. And those generally justify the research dollars to chase after those polymorphisms to understand how they affect people's health.
And we'll ask one more question for today. This question is regarding where to draw the line between biomarkers of exposure and effect. For example, DNA adducts are sometimes characterized in literature as exposure biomarkers rather than health indicators.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's actually that I think the definitions are a little simplistic because the reality of the situation is that they're not. You can't really draw a line because the questioner is exactly right. Adducts are both. They're both an effect, and they can also be used to demonstrate exposure. So there is no distinct line between them. We use terminology to categorize things, and sometimes things kind of defy categorization. Generally speaking, the way that we define biomarkers is an effective way of defining them. But you can always find some examples that kind of blur the lines. And that's what I'd say is that one really kind of blurs into the next, and they're not distinct categories so much. There are definitely examples that blur the line, and adducts are one of those examples that blurs the line. You can use it for both.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. A special thank you, Dr. Reichard, as well as to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. The Education and Research Center Industrial Hygiene webinar series will take place the second Tuesday of every month. This is in addition to our ERC Ergonomics webinar series, which is the third Wednesday of each month. Our next industrial hygiene theme webinar is going to be on Tuesday, December 8th with Dr. Ramachandran on data, professional judgment, and modeling and occupational exposure assessment. And that'll be in partnership with Johns Hopkins Education and Research Center for Occupational Safety and Health. Be sure to check our website for more information and to register for upcoming events. That's coeh@berkeley.edu/aboutce. Thank you again for the wonderful presentation and the questions and participation today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you for having me. This was terrific.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.